Good morning, everyone. Hope everyone is doing well this morning. Show of hands. How many in here like the Roanoke restaurant? Yeah, I do. It's one of my favorite places. The Roanoke, the restaurant. Did you know that it's closing? I found that out yesterday and wanted to cry. Well, I said Matthew told me about it. He'd seen it on the news, and man, I hated that. It made me think of that in 2 Peter, the world that was perished, talking about he's talking about before the flood, but sometimes I think about that passage just in terms of the world around us, because all these things, things seem to be changing. Maybe sometimes for the better, but just as often, if not more so, for the worse. And I can't help but think of that phrase. I also was Brandy and I both for many years were big fans of Famous Anthony's in Roanoke. They had the whole hepatitis thing. I guess they kind of brought that on themselves. Maybe not so much other things to blame as it is with the Roanokers case. But anyway, it's a beautiful day. We're all here. And try to be joyful and press on despite, there's little bits of news like that tend to come along in life. Okay, we're going to go back into Galatians. If you would, bow for a word of prayer. Brother Sam Foley will lead us.
Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this beautiful day that we have. Pray thy word, worship you. Be with us, that we can absorb what is being taught, and also use that to go out and teach others. Thankful for the things that you give us each day. We ask you to be with us, and may we provide other people those things they need if we have extras that we can help them. With our country, you with our leaders, always have the freedom to come here and worship. Most of all, we ask you to forgive us for those things that we commit. It's just in Christ's name.
Amen. Okay, so we're going to actually get back into Galatians this morning. The last two Sundays, we've been looking at Acts 7 through 15, again, because it's pertinent for what we find in Galatians chapter 2. Just to kind of give the 30,000-foot recap, we first meet Saul of Tarsus, the stoning of Stephen in Jerusalem, that event, and Saul's general persecution causes the majority of Christians in Jerusalem to be scattered abroad. We read in Acts 8, except the apostles, they stay behind, and likely some others, not everybody, but the majority flee. We then find Saul heading to Damascus for the purpose of further persecution because he wasn't satisfied to limit it merely to Jerusalem. He encounters the Lord on the road. He is sent to Ananias. He's baptized as he's told to do. He immediately sets forth preaching Christ in Damascus. He runs afoul of his fellow Jews, as is often the case, and they plot to kill him, but the brethren there help him to escape. You recall he's let down in a basket out by the city wall, and he escapes, goes to Jerusalem where he seeks to align himself with the apostles who were there. They understandably want nothing to do with him, but Barnabas steps up and vouches for him, right? And so he joins himself to the disciples there at Jerusalem. He goes forth teaching in Jerusalem just as he had in Damascus. In Jerusalem, he runs afoul of the Grecians, and they plot to kill him. So yet again, the brethren help him to escape. He's taken to Caesarea, and then from there to Tarsus. After that, we go back to Peter and Philip. Philip in Samaria and with the Ethiopian eunuch on the road. We find Peter going, actually that's between 7 and 9, but in chapters 10 and 11, once Saul's gone back to Tarsus, we find Peter going to the household of Cornelius, right? We talked a lot about that. He goes to the household of Cornelius, the first Gentile convert, Peter and a handful of his fellow Jewish disciples, 6 if I'm not mistaken, it tells us. But after that, they go back to Jerusalem, right? Because Joppa is where he was when the men from Cornelius' house came to fetch him. They went to Cornelius, made their way back to Jerusalem. And when he gets there, his fellow Jewish Christians at Jerusalem are upset because Peter has been consorting with Gentiles. And as we discussed, that is a strict no-go for Jews, for Israelites. But Peter tells them the things that he had seen, the things that God had revealed to him. Yes, the gospel is for Gentiles. He confronts them. He stands up. It says that he contends with them. And ultimately, there's agreement. Yes, the gospel is for Gentiles. Meanwhile, all those folks that Saul had scattered abroad back in chapter 8, some of them are in Antioch, and they have begun reaching out to non-Jews. The church in Jerusalem hears about this. Again, this is after Peter and Cornelius, so they dispatch Barnabas to go and help with this effort, right? So Barnabas goes, he joins them there. The church at Antioch is exploding. It's oftentimes called the Great Missionary Church, right? That's where Paul gets dispatched from for his missionary journeys. Barnabas then sends for Paul, who's in Tarsus. He comes to Antioch, and he labors there alongside Barnabas. We have mention of prophets coming from Jerusalem, Agabus among them, talking of the dearth, the famine that's going on there, the need to help. And it's also from Antioch in chapters 13 and 14 that Paul and Barnabas go together on the first missionary journey, right? And it's also, we kind of glossed over it. We didn't look at those in detail, but 2 big things that happen on that journey. This is where Paul and Barnabas are mistaken for Jupiter and Mercury. You recall this? Because they're going to Gentiles, right? These are Greek people, pagans, the heathen, as they're often called in the New Testament. They mistake Paul and Barnabas for Jupiter and Mercury because they see the power that's evident in them and the way they speak. This is also the occasion where Paul is stoned, as they're in the area of Lystra, Iconium, Derbe. Paul is stoned to the point that the people doing it think he's dead. So he's been severely injured, and yet immediately afterward he gets up and goes back into the city. Right? Barnabas, I don't think it mentions Barnabas receiving this treatment with them, but Barnabas is definitely still in the picture. Right? They rejoin and they go about their business, ultimately making their way back to Antioch. And after that, in Acts is where we read about the Jerusalem conference. Right? Acts 15, that's where we started. Because the question in Acts 15 is the problem of Galatians and Romans, but Galatians. Okay, so keep all of that in mind as we go through this, particularly as we get towards the end of chapter 2. Because again, it's hard to wrap your mind around, but it's also a tremendous source of inspiration and encouragement, in my opinion. Okay, so Galatians 1, we left off in verses 15 to 17. But when it pleased God who separated me from my mother's womb and called me by his grace, we talked about that, to reveal his Son in me, that I might preach him among the heathen, again, the Gentiles. Paul speaks of that on several occasions, the fact that he's specifically called to go to the Gentiles. Not just the Gentiles, but specifically the Gentiles. That I might preach him among the heathen. Immediately, I conferred not with flesh and blood. We kind of touched on that briefly. Who can remind us, what's the significance when he says that he didn't confer with flesh and blood? Why is that important? Particularly for the Galatians. He says he didn't confer with flesh and blood. The gospel, what he's going about preaching, where did he get it from? From Christ. What he's preaching comes directly from God. He didn't get it. Where did he get? So Paul is a great student of the law, right? The law of Moses, a Hebrew of Hebrews. Where did he get his knowledge about Judaism from? Gamaliel, right. He was taught by another man, right? Not so here. What he's teaching did not originate with him. More specifically, it didn't originate with any Jewish Christian teachers. I think it's even more to the point, but it comes straight from God. Hence why he told them earlier, if any man preach unto you any other gospel than that which we preach, let him be accursed. Because this is not merely his opinion, it's not merely his theology, his take on things. It is inspired. It comes directly from God. Verse 17, neither went I up to Jerusalem to them which were apostles before me, but I went into Arabia and returned again unto Damascus. Okay, so his fellow apostles. Now, so fellow apostles, Peter, John, and company. They're inspired, are they not? Acts 2, 1 through 4, Pentecost, you find them there. They're assembled together, waiting to receive power from on high, just as Christ had told them to do, right? Luke 24, before he had been taken to be crucified, he had told them, tarry in Jerusalem, wait here until you receive power. And they did, right? On the day of Pentecost, it happens. So his fellow apostles, I think you could argue they're a step above just mere flesh and blood because they are inspired. They were hand-selected by the Lord for a very special purpose, right? So he says he didn't confer with flesh and blood. He did not get his gospel in the same way he learned the law from Gamaliel. Another human being didn't teach him this. But he also didn't get it from fellow apostles either. And that's also important to note. Because again, even though the other apostles are inspired, again, as we find in Acts chapter 2, he also didn't get it from them. So the revelation that he has, the knowledge that he has, the doctrine that he's teaching, not only did he not get it from other people, from other human beings, but he also didn't get it from other humans who could impart it to him by inspired knowledge. He's getting it directly from the source, which is important. And he's adding this for emphasis. Okay. So he didn't go to Jerusalem to those that were apostles before him. He says he went to Arabia and returned again unto Damascus. So where is Arabia, if you think about geography, or at least in this day and age? What region in that part of the world would you call Arabia? If you think about a map, right, you've got Canaan, Judea, Palestine, whatever name it's going by at any given time. To the north of that, you have what we think of today as Syria, right? That's where Damascus is, so north of Jerusalem, north of Galilee. Where would Arabia be in that geographical context? Arabia is to the east. It's kind of really kind of desert territory. If you think about Israel, you think about that seaboard part of Syria. What lies to the east is, generally speaking, Arabia. What's worth noting is that this is Gentile territory. Okay, Arabia is not Jewish territory. What happened while he was there? So he was converted at Damascus, right? He says straight away he went to Arabia, and then he came back to Damascus. What happened while he was in Arabia? Any other thoughts? I guess technically the answer is we don't know. I think it's what I just heard. I think is generally what's commonly thought. What I think. He continued to receive instruction directly from the Lord. But it's just as plausible to say that he did what he had been doing in Damascus, and he continued to go about preaching. So this time that he's in Arabia, is he going about preaching and teaching like he had been doing in Damascus? Or is he kind of going out, into a wilderness setting and just learning from the Lord? We don't know. We don't know at what point he specifically receives the revelation that he has as an apostle or how it happened, but this is what he said. So if you go back to Acts 2, 1 through 4, right, the day of Pentecost, you have the apostles gathered there. They receive this power. They're inspired. It didn't take a lengthy sojourn or a period of instruction for them to have the revelation that they did it? It's like they open their mouths and out comes revelation. They didn't have to go off for several years to some sort of wilderness training to have the inspired knowledge that they did. Right? They receive this power there at Pentecost, and immediately they go forth and they begin speaking by inspiration. Personally, I'm also inclined to think that Acts 9, 19 and following also supports that idea, right? That Paul didn't have to go off to he didn't have to go off to Arabia to be secretly taught by Christ, because his preaching started immediately. And I would assume it was inspired from the beginning. How does this fit with Acts 9? Acts 9. If you're taking what he says here, and you're trying to make heads or tails of this with what we read in Acts. In Acts 23, there's a phrase. It says, after that many days were fulfilled. How many? Right? What happened? Who knows? It's plausible to think that this trip to Arabia fits there. Right? Because remember, in Acts 9, he's converted. He straight away goes and starts preaching. He gets run out of Damascus by Jews who want to kill him. He goes from there to Jerusalem, where it happens again. And from there, he goes to Tarsus, which doesn't, on the surface, doesn't seem to jive at all with what he himself says in Galatians, that he went off to Arabia and then he came back to Damascus. But again, in Acts chapter 9, there is room there, where for this trip that isn't necessarily mentioned in Acts, but either way, he ends up back in Damascus, which certainly makes sense. It's kind of like in the gospel accounts. Let me look here before I put my foot in my mouth. Let's see. Well, we won't go there. Okay, so in Acts 9, again, you have that phraseology that kind of allows for what you find here in Galatians. This is, as I noted, one of those points that people, if they want to take a critical view, will sometimes point to and say, look, these are totally different, but not necessarily. Okay, so he returned to Damascus. That's where it all started for him, right? In a house on the street called Straight. Acts 9, 8 and following. What's the main point here? What is it that the Galatians need to understand, and why he would bother to mention this? Remember what we said at the beginning. He's revisiting all these historical things, and there's a reason for it. And he's not just telling them for the sake of talking or for writing about these things that had happened to him. Given the problem at hand, behind this epistle, what's his point? Why is he reminding them of these things? He didn't receive his apostleship from other men. This mission that he has, this power that he has, he didn't get it from other men. Also, the revelation, what it is that he's preaching and teaching, he didn't get it from other men. He got it straight from God. Remember, the Galatians are listening to other people, are they not? That's the problem here. That problem we found in Acts chapter 15, the Judaizing doctrine, the Galatians are being swayed by it. They need to listen to Paul, not to these other people. Hence why he would remind them of these things. The implied question, right? He doesn't come out and say this, but if you're one of the Galatians, you're reading this, the question that ought to be coming to their minds, and he keeps on making points like this throughout the epistle, is, can the Judaizing teachers say this? Can the Judaizing teachers say what Paul is saying here? And the answer is they can't. They can't. You could say the same thing about people teaching religious doctrine today, right? They'll say, well, here's what God wants you to know. Here's what the Bible means. I mean, there are 30,000 different ideas, different theologies, different flavors out there. But the question comes back to, can those people say the same thing that Peter and Paul could say? They can't. So, I don't know about you, but I'll stick with Peter and Paul, right? It's kind of like today, if you have folks who are of a premillennialist, eschatological bent, right? That is to say, they think that the kingdom is still something that's way out in the future. It hasn't come yet. When you read books like Amos and Zechariah and Joel, they're all talking about stuff that even today in 2022 is yet future. On Pentecost, Peter quotes Joel, speaking about end times prophecy, the last days, this thing that the Israelites are looking forward to, and he applies it to that point in time. He says, the things that you're seeing and hearing, this is that was spoken by the prophet Joel. All right, so I've got Peter who says that what Joel was talking about was realized at Pentecost. On the other hand, I've got probably just about any mainstream Protestant denomination preacher up and down this road saying, no, it isn't. What Joel was talking about is something that's yet future to come. I'll stick with Peter, right? Why? Because Peter is inspired. The Galatians ought to be asking themselves, these Judaizing teachers we're listening to, can they say what Paul just said? The answer is no, they can't. So they ought to listen to Paul. Okay, verses 18 and 19, continuing on. Then, after 3 years, I went up to Jerusalem to see Peter and abode with him 15 days. But other of the apostles saw I none, save James, the Lord's brother. Okay, so, is this, and hopefully you can start getting an appreciation as we're working through this for why chronology is difficult, is this 3 years after his conversion, or is this 3 years after he left Damascus? Any thoughts? Again, kind of keeping in mind what we discussed in Acts. He says after 3 years he went to Jerusalem to see Peter. 3 years from when? Because he doesn't say. Is this 3 years after the events at Ananias' house? Or 3 years after he left Damascus? Remember, he got let down by the rope from the wall. Which is it?
Sounds like
After he left Damascus? It sounds like, really, there's no right answer to this question. You have to kind of think it through and give, because he doesn't say. He doesn't specify. I'm inclined to think the former, that he's 3 years from his conversion he goes. Again, it could be either, but the 3 years, so if that's the case, then the 3 years that he mentions here would entail his initial preaching in Damascus, the trip to Arabia that he mentions, and the events that followed after his return back to Damascus. Right? This was when his fellow Jews wanted to kill him and he had to be let down by the wall. If you go back to Acts 9, let me see here. Acts 9, 23 to 26. Let's see. It says, after that many days were fulfilled, the Jews took counsel to kill him. Okay? The many days that were fulfilled would entail most of this 3-year period. Right? So it just says many days. I mean, how many days is many days? I don't know. It's a significant amount of time. But if you take that in Acts, you have many days being spent, and then you have what Paul has to say in Galatians. You don't necessarily have a conflict between the two. You just have one being far more detailed than the other. So many days being fulfilled would entail this 3-year period. And then after he escapes from Damascus, he heads to Jerusalem, just as he indicates in Galatians 1:18, because that's where he heads in Acts, right? After all of that, after everything that ensued in Damascus, he went to Jerusalem, right? He says the same thing himself in Galatians. So it would make sense to me, and again, take it for what it's worth, because you're trying to piece these things together without a tremendous amount of detail to go on. These things he mentions in Galatians about Arabia are part and parcel of what happens during the time he's in Damascus in Acts. Does that make sense? So in Acts, we only read about him being in Damascus and then going to Jerusalem and then to Tarsus. In Galatians, he talks about this trip to Arabia and then going back to Damascus. Again, in Acts 9, he's in Damascus, he's doing many things. In Acts 9:23, it talks about many days being fulfilled before things finally wrap up there. What he mentions in Galatians would fit within that time frame. Does that make sense? I guess, and the reason I mention all of this is because if you're just stories like these So a lot, and people have different views on it, but many think, and I would tend to agree given the context and what you read there, he's talking about evangelists working in the churches the same way that Paul did at Ephesus or Galatians. They're messengers. They're those who were there proclaiming the word. The context helps you discern the meaning of it. It's kind of like an elder, right? When we see the word elder, do you mean an older, mature person, or do you mean a person who holds a particular position in the congregation? It's the same word. The context drives the word deacon is the same way, right? Just the word deacon by itself merely means a servant. So when you see the word deacon, does it merely mean a servant, or does it mean someone who has a particular role, a particular position with qualifications and everything in a congregation? Again, the context kind of has to drive it. An apostle, the word itself merely means a person sent with a message. It usually refers to the 12 who were specifically chosen by the Lord and the very unique position that they held, right? If you go to Acts 1, 21 to 26, you read about that. Again, these are very special people, right? In Acts chapter 8, you find that this miraculous power, it goes by different names, but this power that only apostles could confer by laying their hands upon others, right? You know, Peter and John had to be sent because they are apostles. It means something specific there. In Acts 14:14, this reference to Barnabas, and also to James, the Lord's brother, in Galatians 1:19, give two instances where I would argue the term is used in a generic sense. And there's a reason we're about to see here in a second. Because if you go back and you look at the apostles being called by the Lord, Matthew 10, Mark 4, Luke 6, you have them listed. There's a James, the brother of John, right? These are the sons of Zebedee. There's James, the son of Alphaeus. There's no James, the Lord's brother there. And yet here in Galatians, Paul talks about conferring with apostles, and he mentions James, the Lord's brother, being one of them, which incidentally is believed to be the same James that wrote the book of James in the New Testament, but that's another thing. Okay, so here's the deal. Do you remember back in Galatians 1, 6, and 7, where Paul talks about another gospel